Hey guys, it's my isopods and more with me. I hope everything's going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones that you love. It's Friday. I hope you're going to have a great one. I'm getting there. My kiddo just left. I had my other kiddo spend the night the following night, so we're going to focus a little bit on isopods. What I'm going to do is talk to you about how I water my isopods. Now, I always encourage you guys to think a little bit differently. I hear a lot of people say you water them this often, you do this and that, but a lot of that depends on you and your circumstances and environment around you. What I mean is I watch a lot of, what I consider a lot of isopod content. Watch Supreme Gecko, Russet Aquarimax, Big Red's isopods, and others that I comment on their channels and pay attention to. I read things I see on forums and Discord and Facebook groups. And what I'm getting at is what works for you may not work for me, and what's optimal for me may not be optimal for you. I live in an apartment in Michigan, and that's different from someone who lives in a house in Arizona potentially, and so on. Obviously, you know of the different climates of the world and different conditions. Additionally, I know some people do isopods a little bit differently, and that maybe it's a side business or a separate aspect of a larger portion of what they do. So they may not attend to their isopods the same way I do, and I know a lot of people don't. I hear a lot of people say they check them, kind of water them once a week or, something like that every 10 days. And I get that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I check if I go more than 3 days without popping all my bins and just checking them out, that's a long time for me. I water my isopods twice a week, but sometimes 3 times a week. And what I'm getting at with that is, I may not saturate my isopods as much as you may because of the isopods you have, the environment around you, and the degree that you check them and things like that. The amount of times that you water them and all of that. Those all come into play. And the last thing I want to say with that is I encourage you to always look at different methods. I see a lot of people with very similar setups where they have the hydration station on one side, the substrate on the other, and I get that. They just spray it and go. Now, I do things a little bit differently. So I do spray on occasion, but I don't do it generally directly. I have my water bottle, I hold it up about 2 feet and I mist it. And then I do a lot of what I call dripping. I like to saturate my pieces of wood. I notice a lot of everything, all sizes of isopods munching on it. I just like that. I notice a lot of mankite coming out and eating the moist wood on the surface. So I do the same thing with leaves and rocks. I do a lot of drip saturation. And I do that because I encourage you all to give your isopods, or pets in general, we're talking specifically about isopods here, true diversity and variety. Give them a chance to regulate temperature at different layers of substrate, different types of substrate. One may be more leafy and loamy, one may be more densely packed substrate. Allowing them to have direct contact to moisture, which is why I like to drip on leaves. It leaves the drip there for sometimes a day and a half or 2, that they have access to that moisture, which is different than the moisture in the sphagnum moss, which is different than humidity. So all of those things come into play, and I encourage you to, again, hopefully what I was showing here with a few of these, I'm not going to show all of my bins, but just when I go through and do a little bit more of the active, because all of my bins are a little bit different in the way I set them up, which includes the way that I water them and do their husbandry. So I've prattled on enough. I hope everything's going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. Let's hop into some bins. Go easy. For a little bit of clarity, I'm actually editing in this commentary after I've shot the video, So I'm going to kind of say what I see. This is my zebra bin. The left side is the moist side. The right side is the dry side. I do kind of add a little bit of what I guess call topical moisture to certain spots on the dry side in most of my bins. So I actually have one spot where I do no surface moisture at all or anything like that. I don't drip any onto the substrate. In this particular bin, it would be the lower right side. I will drip water into that little hole in this piece of wood that goes through and leaves a little bit on the underside of this wood also, even though that's on the dry side. So again, I don't keep it 100% dry on this side with these guys. And then I'll start to do the drips. I'm a little bit mindful in the leaf all the way to the left because I don't want it to pool, as I've seen a couple very small mankai hang out in the substrate that collected in that leaf. And then I'll usually pick a spot like here and drip down a leaf, let it run naturally down, just see where it goes. Sometimes it will be a piece of wood. In fact, I think in a little bit you'll see me do that with the piece of cork bark that's kind of sticking up in the center. I'll just drip it up there and let it roll down itself. But you'll see I just take time and drip onto the pieces of wood, and with some it's a little bit more tricky with the angles and all of that. And this part I will saturate the soil. I do have a small amount of substrate on top of the sphagnum moss under there. I do have a few parts where it's exposed, but for the most part I do put a little bit of substrate or leaves or wood over most of the sphagnum moss in my hydration station. That's just my preference. So I'm a little bit more water heavy on this time. I'll do the lower left part by the red rock. There's actually a leaf stem there that doesn't come out very well, but that's the part I'll drip water into this time. And while I do a little bit of saturation in the top left part, I don't do it so heavy. I usually alternate just to make sure the substrate stays good and moist. So this time I'm focusing a little bit more on the bottom left part and leaving the bottom right part. But again, you'll see me saturate both parts. I also like to try to, I won't say saturate heavily, but leave a good amount of water where leaves contact substrate or substrate contacts wood, or leaves contact wood, or any of those combinations, because then they tend to retain a little bit of water in there. Same thing with rocks or the various types of mosses. The more you can keep those things in contact with each other and have moisture in there, it kind of retains it a little bit better. In this bin and a lot of others, you'll see me drip water pretty good onto the red, I think they're just normal aquarium rocks. I don't think there's a particular name for them. But my point is, I do also like to keep those saturated for moisture, as I see mankai out there very frequently. Springtails collect on there a lot, and so do adults. But again, it offers another source of moisture to them. Maybe they have a different preference, and not only in terms of drinking directly, but just what moisture is around them. It gives them more variety there. So in the lower right, which is again the more dry side, I do drip a little bit on the red rock, and I think later I'll put a few drops on the leaf that's a little bit to the right of there. But like I say, for the most part, I don't put anything that will go down into the substrate. I try to keep that spot pretty dry, aside from the occasional misting it may get. But when I mist, I usually try to keep the mist only to the moist side, but I do let it bleed over a little bit on occasion. That's kind of to simulate whether it's a rain or fog, things like those that come in and just kind of add moisture everywhere. And this is the spot where I say I'm dripping it onto a leaf stem that's actually protruding out through the substrate, but it doesn't view very well from this angle. So again, I personally do this 2 or 3 times a week, where I know some people only hydrate or check on their isopods, again, sometimes once a week or sometimes a little bit more. I've heard of people doing it 10 days to 2 weeks, which again, if you're doing it that way, this may dry out long before that period. So again, these are the things where I talk about exploring different possibilities, but all based on what you do with your lifestyle, because obviously you don't want anything to negatively affect your buddies in there. I also find this somewhat soothing and relaxing. I won't say it's artistic or anything, but it's fun to do and see, and especially opening it over the next few days and seeing where the water has saturated in and where it's still kind of beaded up, or you can see where they're collecting, where again it is already absorbed into a leaf or some of the wood or substrate, and you can see the isopods engaging with it. Again, whether they're eating it or just regulating whatever it is they are, you can see them actively engaging with it very often. Before we hop into this next bin, let's do a quick flyby up close and personal with what we just did. So first things first, here the left side is the moist side, the right side is the dry side, as last time. So I spray it down, and then I usually drip onto that large leaf in the lower left corner and let it drip down into that side. There's actually a big fungal spore patch down there. I'll also drip along this little piece of wood that's laying on top of this wood. There's substrate and leaves beneath it. And what I'm trying to do is create a moisture pocket or microenvironment there on top of that other piece of wood. So I drip pretty heavily there to try to get the wood saturated on top and the substrate to absorb some of that surrounding water into it. In the top left, it's pretty bare, but I'll generally put a good portion of water over there just to let it saturate slowly into the substrate there and kind of see what happens. I let the water also pool in a few of these leaves with the substrate there. Not too much water, but just so it will slowly absorb or dry up over time. And this top piece is an interesting piece because it's angled and very difficult to get the water to stick, but I'm slowly getting used to it, and it's easier in some spots than others. And I think I'll actually come back to it a lot more later, but I'll focus on the moss here. I'm dripping through the leaf litter onto the moss underneath, and I'll do it a little bit more frequently towards the red rock and eventually saturate that red rock also. I saturate a little more heavily to the top left, and similar to my zebra bin, the entire right side, almost, I would say the last quarter of the right side of the bin, I will not at all drip any water onto the substrate. Some of it may occasionally drip off from a roll off of a leaf, or where it pools too much and beads over off of a piece of wood, but I won't generally drip anything directly onto that substrate. Drop some more onto the moss, and then as mentioned, I'll kind of saturate that red rock. And as I mentioned, this is pretty mundane or boring in that I do spend a lot of time and focus on that moss. That's a big part of me trying to keep that going and moist. And then on the right side, I do have, again, one of those porous red aquarium rocks. And as I mentioned, I will drip a little bit on top of this wood piece to let it just kind of make sure it's decomposing a little bit. It dries up pretty fast. And I actually realize I'm going to throw some leaf litter on that right side because they're destroying it. It's pretty neat. And the further I go to the right side, the more particular I am about making sure to drip on the wood and not on the substrate, where you see me right there dripping very heavily onto the substrate, where I don't care if some of it drips down into the bottom. I'm going to do some moss touch-ups, and that should be about it. And then we're going to do another little flyby here.